cleared land. They worked in the fields. They cultivated the vegetables, the rice, the corn, and increasingly the cotton. Black women cooked. They operated spinning wheels. They cleaned plantation houses. They cared for children. The wealthier Indians had slave coachmen and butlers. Black slaves were also stevedores who loaded and unloaded the ships and the steamboats that operated in the Indian Territory. Slaves in Indian Territory, however, were different in a couple of important regards from those slaves who existed in what I call the Old South. First, because many of these black slaves understood and spoke English, they often became the interpreters, or as the Indians would say, the linksters between Indian peoples and English-speaking peoples, usually the whites. And among the Seminole Indians, their black slaves understood not just English, but they also understood Spanish, and they spoke, obviously, the Seminole language. Of course, not all African Americans who were slaves of the Indians were bilingual or bicultural. Some of these families had been among the Indians for generations, and they, in effect, became black Indians. And when I say they became black Indians, I mean they adopted the Indian dress, they followed the Indian diet, they used native medicine, they practiced Indian modes of agriculture. They even celebrated Indian holidays. These are Choctaw slaves, ex-slaves in this instance, in 1866. This was a picture taken right after the Civil War. As in Texas, the Civil War brought freedom to the Indians, to the Indian-owned black slaves. But unlike the Texas situation, their liberation, that is the liberation of blacks in the Indian Territory, came long before the end of the war. Indian nations quickly divided between pro-Union and pro-Confederate supporters, and thus they created a little civil war going on throughout the Indian Territory. Indeed, a lot of people don't realize this, but proportionally more people were killed doing the fighting in the Indian Territory than in any other state or territory in the nation. Let me repeat that. We think about the numbers of people who were killed in Tennessee or Virginia or at Gettysburg, but in proportion to their population, more people were killed in the Indian Territory than in any state or any other territory during the time of the Civil War. By the fall of 1861, one Confederate Cherokee Indian regiment had been founded under Stand Watie. By the end of 1861, a Union regiment for the Cherokees was created under John Drew. Drew's Indian regiment, eventually had 1,000 men, and those 1,000 men included black men, included ex-slaves. In other words, this was one of the ways in which black slaves of the Indians could get out of slavery. Indeed, Drew was very proud of the fact that he issued a call that was fairly long, but I'm going to quote just part of it. The call said that all persons, without reference to color, who are willing to fight for the American flag and the federal government should join his regiment, should join this group of Indian soldiers. Think about this, Indian soldiers, but indeed, many of those Indian soldiers are actually black men. By 1863, about 10,000 Cherokees remained loyal to the United States, and 7,000 supported the Confederacy. If the Indians were divided between the Confederacy and the Union causes, black slaves in the Indian country faced no such dilemma. Even before the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, Major A.C. Ellenthorpe, the white commander of the 1st Indian Home Guard, said, and I'm quote here, "The Negroes in the territory have somehow become impressed with the idea that the war is being waged on their account, and that for the present time, their shackles will fall and their race will be free." This was said in 1861, 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. I don't know if the Native Americans and the Indians, and the blacks who were slaves of the Native Americans knew something that we didn't, but they were very perceptive. They understood that this was going to be a war for liberation. These fugitives became soldiers. And of course, I want to explain the slide on the screen. This is Silas Jefferson, who is a member of the 1st Indian Home Guard. The 1st Indian Home Guard was one of those Indian regiments created, in this instance, with the Creeks, not with the Cherokees, but with the Creeks. What is ironic, and I'm sorry you can't read the descriptive book on the right. But what is ironic about the first Indian Home Guards is that 40% of these Indian soldiers were in effect former black slaves. 40% of these, quote, Indian soldiers were former black slaves. In other words, these regiments that were being created in the West were far more integrated than any regiments that would be created in the East, despite all the discussion of glory and all of that entails. Thousands of other blacks would join the cause and join the fight in the Indian Territory, and they would be involved in battles such as Cabin Creek. I won't go down the entire list, but Honey Springs and Cabin Creek in Arkansas and Indian Territory, respectively, and they would help to break the power of the Confederacy in the West. But more than breaking the power of the Confederacy, they would, in effect, gain their freedom. In other words, those who became soldiers in the Union Army automatically became free, and their families often followed them in the freedom. And of course, the disruption that was going on all over Indian Territory created a situation whereby slaves and now ex-slaves literally had taken their liberty by simply walking away from the plantations. Thus, when the fighting ended in 1865 in the Indian Territory, and by the way, it ended, the last Confederate general to surrender during the Civil War was General Stan Watte in August of 1865. When the fighting ended in Indian Territory, there wasn't a single slave left. Indeed, slavery had died, or slavery had been destroyed long before. This is the Cherokee National Council Act of Emancipation. This is in 1863, but I suggest that slavery was dying in 1863, and indeed it was dying long before in the Indian Territory. If it were only that simple in the rest of the Old South. I want to shift our attention, shift our focus to the other areas of the West that did not have, well, actually, that theoretically should not have had slaves, but in point of fact, actually had slavery. And I want to talk about the way in which slavery was contested. That is, those people who were going to be involved in the process of challenging slavery in those areas. Obviously, there were very few people who could successfully contest slavery in Texas, and there were some Indian abolitionists, and certainly they came to the fore in the Civil War. But for the most part, slavery was not contested in the Indian Territory, but it would be in other areas. In the interest of time, I'm going to abbreviate some of the discussion, and one of the areas I'm going to cut out is Oregon. I'm sorry, but I do want to show you a couple of the images that reflect on the nature of slavery elsewhere in the West. Remember, we said the slavery was legal in one other area, one other territory in the West, and that strangely, at least for me, strangely, was Utah. The Mormons embraced slavery. And indeed, I wish we had more time to talk about this. This image depicts the Mormon migration. And of course, among those who came with the original Brigham Young Party, the party that reached the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, among that party were 3 black slaves, including a man who allegedly was Brigham Young's personal bodyguard, and that man is on the right here. His name, strangely enough, Green Flake. I had the distinct pleasure of interviewing his granddaughter in Pocatello, Idaho, in 1973. She and her family are still devout Mormons to this day. And that was one of the things that I think made me realize that the West is different in so many ways, and certainly the African-American experience is different in so many ways, because I began to encounter a number of blacks who were Mormon, despite the difficulties, as many of you know, in that church, but despite the prejudice and discrimination. These are actually Mormon pioneers, and as you can see on the lower photograph, there's a black woman right in the middle. She was actually a friend of Joseph Smith. She came out to Utah in 1848, and indeed, you'll encounter other blacks who had slightly different experiences with the Mormon church and the West. There was also slavery in Oregon. And again, I know this seems hard to imagine. very, very difficult to imagine. But there were those who came from Missouri and Tennessee and other areas in the South who brought their slaves with them. And even though slavery was never fully established, certainly never legally established in Oregon, slaves were nonetheless present. As the dean indicated, I taught in I taught at the University of Oregon. The University of Oregon is located in Eugene, Oregon, and Eugene is in a county that's named after Joseph Lane. And Joseph Lane, interestingly, was the vice presidential candidate on what was called the Southern Party ticket in 1860. But he was also a slaveholder and very proud of it. And he kept slaves, a few slaves, in the Eugene area almost up until the time, actually even after slavery had officially ended. He kept a black man as a body servant, I guess informally, up until the time of his death. There were numerous other examples of slaves in Oregon. Indeed, you know that there are slave narratives. Those narratives have been collected. There is one compilation of slave narratives for Oregon, and these two, Lou Southworth and Mary Jane Shipley, are former slaves in Oregon. But that's not the area in which the slavery was going to be contested. Indeed, there were relatively few slaves in both Utah and Oregon. There would be a much larger number of black slaves held illegally in California. And California ultimately represents the best example of the attempt to establish slavery and the successful defeat of that attempt. That is, there would be those who would rise to the fore to try to make sure that slavery would not plant itself in California. Throughout the 1850s, Southern slaveholders brought their bond servants into California to work in the gold fields and in the cities. But California slaveholders did not anticipate the role that a dedicated minority of black and white abolitionists would play in undermining the peculiar institution in this region, that is, in California. Throughout the 1850s, California slaves and anti-slavery activists literally worked side by side in the mining fields or on the city streets. This close proximity of slave and abolitionists exposed the bondservants to direct contact with their champions, a position that was impossible in the eastern United States. In other words, think about the abolitionist movement and think about the pro-slavery movement. Those who were pro-slavery, for the most part, were in the South. Those who were pro-slavery were in the overwhelming majority, and there was very little dissent against the pro-slavery position in most states in the South. By the same token, at least by, let's say, the 1850s, the late 1850s, abolitionist sentiment, or at least anti-slavery sentiment, and I do make a distinction between the two, anti-slavery sentiment was overwhelming in the North. Imagine both Northerners and Southerners, though, coming to California in the gold rush and occupying the same ground. And that's where slavery becomes contested. That's where the question of whether or not slavery is going to exist becomes an immediate question, not a theoretical question that's being debated by Boston intellectuals as opposed to Charleston intellectuals, but a real and practical question debated by people who saw each other on the streets of California, the streets of the cities of California. California's 4,000 African Americans became caught up in the struggle. As I've already indicated, about 1/4 of them were actually bond servants or slaves, even though theoretically slavery didn't exist. However, those blacks who were not slaves, those blacks who for the most part were from the northern states, were going to do everything they could to try to break free their brethren, to try to make sure that slavery would not take deep roots in the South, in California. Understand these blacks who came to California at the time. California was the only state in the antebellum United States where freeborn men and women from northern states, such as Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, and Ohio, literally rubbed shoulders with slaves from Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, and Texas. But California's black leadership disproportionately was pulled from the north, and increasingly it was pulled from abolitionist circles. In other words, a number of black abolitionists who had been active in Boston and in New York and in Philadelphia found their way to California, and they continued, I meant to say they continued their struggle. What I should have said was that they intensified their struggle once they got in the midst of those who were slaves. But I would also add one other point to this, and that's the fact that black Californians had wealth, relatively speaking. Relatively speaking, black Californians had wealth. And it's that wealth that was going to be used to finance a remarkable series of campaigns that would eventually result in the freedom of a number of blacks who were held in bondage. Let me give you an example of that wealth, an example of how that wealth came to be, although you can probably figure it out on your own. In December of 1851, a letter from a black gold miner to his wife in St. Genevieve City, Missouri, indicated how California appeared to this person at the time. I'm quoting here, "I am now mining about 25 miles from Sacramento City, and I'm doing well. I have been working for myself for the past 2 months, and I have cleared $300. Now, folks, you have to understand that $300 is about what many workers would earn in an entire year. California is the best country in the world to make money. It is also the best place for black folks on the globe. All a man has to do is work, and he will make money." Okay. Okay, but you can understand the sentiment, and you can understand for this man, California was going to be the promised land. And I would suggest to you that he and others like him who were successful in the gold fields, because most people were not, whether they were black, white, Asian, or not, but he and others who were successful in the gold fields would use this as a basis for wealth to challenge for the freedom of other black folks. Let me give you some examples. Peter Lester and Mifflin Gibbs were two of these black abolitionists in California. Lester and Gibbs had come from Philadelphia. They had been prominent in the abolitionist movement back east. But as importantly, they opened the Shoe and Boot Emporium in San Francisco in 1851, and they made a ton of money. They made a great deal of money. Indeed, they sold boots all up and down the West Coast. And Lester especially had become a fairly wealthy man by 1855, and he could have turned his back. He literally could have turned his back on slaves. They, after all, were not part of his world. They did not directly affect his welfare or his well-being. And yet Lester and Mifflin Gibbs decided to continue their abolitionist activities and now to bankroll those activities with the profits from their shoe store. Peter Lester, for instance, would invite slaves, known slaves, into his house, and he would have, well, first of all, he would lecture them on their rights as free people, but more importantly, he would put them in contact with lawyers who were willing to challenge for their freedom. And as Lester wrote, when they left, meaning when they left his home, we had them strong in the spirit of freedom. They were leaving slavery every single day. And what he meant by that was that these people were now imbued with the idea that they indeed could challenge for their freedom, and they now realized that there were others who would help them. Let me give you another example. This is, even to me right now, this is a strange ad. Imagine San Francisco Herald coupled with a runaway slave. It's an image that we don't usually think of. But yet there were runaways, and of course, if there were runaways and there were ads for runaways, then there must have been slavery. There must have been slavery as well. Capturing fugitive slaves in California. Again, it's something that you don't normally associate with the state of California. California abolitionists, black abolitionists: Mifflin Gibbs, Mary Ellen Pleasant, Peter Lester. We've already talked about Lester. Let's talk about Mary Ellen Pleasant. And again, I apologize to you because we could do a whole lecture on Mary Ellen Pleasant. She was a remarkable woman. She was free. She had been free all of her life. But she was also dedicated to the destruction of slavery. She came to California from somewhere in the East. And she, at first, began to cook for wealthy miners. And you have to understand that there was this image, and this sort of stereotypical image, that black women could cook better than other folks. And the miners were essentially a bachelor society, and so her skills were in great demand. And as a result, she was able to get as much in a week as a cook as many miners earned in the mine fields in the same period of time. And so as a result, she was able to make a great deal of money. And from that money, she was able to start a series of laundries. We always think of laundries in the Chinese, but the first person to dominate the laundry trade in San Francisco was Mary Ellen Pleasant. And from the laundries, she went into real estate. She eventually owned boarding houses. One of the boarding houses, this gets a little bit ahead of the story, but one of the boarding houses which she owned had a resident who was elected governor of California in 1871 while he was a resident of her house. And on and on and on. But most importantly, I don't want to tire you out with all of this stuff. Most importantly, she was a founder of the Bank of California. She was one of the people who founded the Bank of California. In other words, this is a woman who, by all intents and purposes, was successful. She was successful by any standard. She was certainly one of the wealthiest women, black or white or Asian, anywhere in the West. But even in the 1850s, she devoted herself to the anti-slavery cause. And when I mean devoted herself, I don't mean she just gave money. She literally used the basement of her residence and her various businesses to secret away fugitive slaves, to allow them a place for shelter, a place to hide. But as importantly, she used her wealth to essentially pay for lawyers who would contest for their freedom. And she used her wealth to campaign, to engage in various campaigns to bring about the destruction of slavery, the formal destruction of slavery in California. Mary Ellen Pleasant is a remarkable woman. We haven't said the last about her. We're going to talk about her when we return to San Francisco in the post-Civil War period, because she is going to become involved in a whole host of other activities, some of which are going to be quite controversial and remain controversial to this day. And then finally, let me go to the next slide. There is Bridget Biddy Mason. I don't know if anyone, and very few people in this room have heard of her. She's another remarkable woman. She was a Mormon slave, or let me put it like this. She was a slave of a Mormon slaveholder who brought her to Utah, and then fortunately for her, he brought her to San Bernardino, and it's in San Bernardino, California, that she decided to contest for her freedom, and eventually by 1855, she gained not only her freedom, but the freedom of her extended family of about 18 people. And this was one of the grand examples of the struggle for freedom in California. Biddy Mason also went on to become, I don't know if it was purposely, but certainly by accident, one of the wealthiest women in Los Angeles, because she bought land early when Los Angeles had 3,000 people, and she waited for the town to grow. That's all she had to do, just wait for the town to grow. And she made a great deal of money. And indeed, I find this so ironic. If you go to Los Angeles, go to downtown Los Angeles, those of you who know Los Angeles will know exactly where I mean. You go to downtown Los Angeles, and across the street from the Ronald Reagan Federal Building is a series of monuments dedicated to Bridget Biddy Mason, because she, in effect, owned that entire, what is now a commercial block, but that was the original Mason homestead. It was on the edge of Los Angeles in the 1860s. It is now quite literally in downtown Los Angeles today. I use these examples, and there are others, but I use these examples to suggest to you that these were people who were engaged in the anti-slavery struggle. They used their wits, they used their wealth to challenge slavery every single day, and in the process of doing so, they made slavery much more difficult to be maintained in California. Now, they shouldn't have had to do it, because California theoretically is a free state. But unfortunately, that didn't mean anything when there were slaveholders who were dedicated to trying to maintain slavery there. I'm going to end this discussion of California with a quote from a German immigrant. This German remarked in 1857, and I'm quoting here, "The wealthy California Negroes exhibit a great deal of energy and intelligence, in saving their brethren." I believe he's exactly right, because it's through their struggles that slavery would not take root in California in that period. Let me switch our discussion 2,000 miles to the east, to the other edge of the West, of the region that we call the West, and that's Kansas. It's actually the Kansas-Missouri border, and we're going to talk partly about Bleeding Kansas, and all of you know that term, but we're going to talk about much more than the kind of general history that you know about Bleeding Kansas. In 1860, Kansas had 627, Kansas Territory had 627 African Americans. By 1865, it had 12,000. They comprised 9% of the population. a larger percentage of Kansas's population than they do today. They're probably about 3% of the population of Kansas today. Why did this happen? Well, in some ways, the map on the screen shows it. Kansas Territory was situated right next to Missouri, which was a major slaveholding state. And unfortunately for the Missouri slaveholders, most of the Missouri slaves were situated about 100 miles or less from that western border. That is, those who were in the western part of Missouri. And as a result, it didn't take much for many of those blacks to run away. But I would suggest to you that there's a lot going on in Kansas, some of which you have learned in your other general history classes. As I said, Kansas was bleeding, quote unquote, by the late 1850s, and it was bleeding because literally a struggle was going on between those who were in favor of slavery and those who were opposed to it. Kansas had two governments in 1856, one at Lecompton, which was pro-slavery, one at Topeka, which was anti-slavery. And in the midst of all of this, came abolitionists who not only were anti-slavery in the general sense, like most of the white Kansans, but abolitionists who wanted to destroy slavery immediately and incorporate blacks as full-fledged citizens. Now, I want to be very careful here. White abolitionists in Kansas were nowhere near the majority of the white Kansans, but they were a people who were going to be heard, and they were a people who would have a decided impact upon those blacks who would eventually call Kansas their home. The abolitionists in the 1850s, the late 1850s, organized the Underground Railroad that ran into Kansas and ran essentially to the most, quote, liberty-loving city in Kansas at that time, Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence, Kansas, as all of you know, is the home of the University of Kansas. In 1856, 1857, 1858, it was the slaveholders' hell because it was a town that was organized by abolitionists from New England, and those abolitionists would do everything they could to destroy the institution of slavery. And there were others who lived in Kansas, including John Brown for a while. John Brown's not from Kansas, but John Brown lived in and operated in Kansas in the late 1850s. John Brown and James Montgomery and James Lane and others would literally go into Missouri and rescue black people, black men and women, and bring them to freedom in Kansas. Now, to the slaveholders, they were stealing. Okay, let's be very clear on this. To the slaveholders, they were stealing property. But to those black men and women who were rescued, they were a godsend. To those black women and men who were rescued by individuals like John Brown, they were a godsend. Indeed, one of the points that I think should be made very, very clearly here is that Kansas is the only place that I know of in the entire nation where white men literally risked their lives to go into a slave territory to free black women and children and men. Now, we know of Harriet Tubman in the East, but I don't know of any instance where white males actually engaged in this kind of activity except in Kansas. But I would also suggest to you that far more slaves were going to act on their own. That is, some slaves would be rescued by John Brown and others, but far more slaves would rescue themselves. That is, they would make their way to Lawrence, Kansas. They would make their way to the Kansas-Missouri border, which literally symbolized freedom. The western border of Missouri symbolized freedom. They would make that dash to the Missouri border, and they would go into Kansas territory, and from there they would be free people. I love this. This is a slide that's from a mural that's in the Kansas State Capitol. So they have embraced John Brown, okay? Or at least many of them have embraced John Brown. Yeah, he's larger than life there. But let me talk not about John Brown, because you all know that story. Let me talk about Henry Clay Bruce. Henry Clay Bruce was an African-American slave from Missouri. He eventually decides to strike out for his freedom. And essentially what he does is steal himself. By the way, Henry Clay Bruce is the brother, for those of you who know African-American history, he's the brother of Blanche K. Bruce, who becomes the second black senator in U.S. history after Hiram Revels, who of course has a Seattle connection that we'll talk about a little bit later on in these lectures. But Henry Clay Bruce essentially steals himself and his fiancée from Missouri to Kansas in 1863. And this is part of the statement. I won't read the whole thing to you, but you get a sense of what's going on here. On July 8, 1862, the Leavenworth Daily Conservative, I love this title, the Leavenworth Daily Conservative described the thousands of Missouri slaves who had made their way into Kansas and found freedom in Kansas. The paper said, and I'm quoting here, these poor souls found their way into the Union lines, protected and brought by the Union soldiers into the freedom-loving state of Kansas. Others still crossed the Missouri River in search of liberty on a bridge of ice, which God, in his infinite wisdom, has built for their special accommodation. I don't know, but understand what's going on. Obviously, the conservative is saying that there's a phenomenon that's happening, that there are thousands and thousands of black folks who are finding liberty in Kansas. And indeed, they were welcomed, or many of them were welcomed, by Kansas abolitionists, white and black. Indeed, there was the Kansas Emancipation League, one of the most active, one of the most radical of the abolitionist organizations in the country at the time. Let me read to you the words of one of the members of that league, Richard Cordley. Now, there's no reason you would know Richard Cordley. He's certainly not Wendell Phillips or William Lloyd Garrison, but he was as dedicated to the cause of the destruction of slavery as they were. Cordley talks about these blacks who were coming into Kansas in 1862, 1864. And he says this: the Negroes are not coming. They are here. And they will stay here. They are to be our neighbors, whatever we may think about it, whatever we may do about it. He and the Emancipation League and others in other organizations, like the Ladies Refugee Aid Society, which was a black women's organization. And this is a remarkable group because these were black women who themselves had been slaves only a few years earlier. These organizations provided all kinds of support and means of rescue for those who were coming into Kansas in 1863, 1862, 1863, 1864. As these black folks entered Kansas, they tried to help as best they could. They found jobs as best they could. Mostly they found jobs harvesting the crops because Kansas, and Kansas was very proud of this, Kansas sent the largest proportion of its male population into the Union Army of any state in the nation. Kansas sent the largest proportion of its male population into the Union Army. So there are a lot of farms that are understaffed, and a lot of these black folks began to work on these wheat farms and various other farms in order to help the Kansas economy. But I would argue that most black men, much like most white men in Kansas, went into the Army. Black men especially, those from Missouri, those from the Indian Territory, those fugitives from the Indian Territory, those from Arkansas, knew that the only way they could be truly free was to destroy the institution of slavery. Let me go ahead here. This is a recruitment poster, but there really didn't need to be much recruitment because a lot of African American males decided to join the Union Army. And in fact, we all think in terms of Glory, the movie with Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, which officially was the first regiment to be recognized by the War Department, but unofficially, the first blacks to be organized into a military unit at the state level. Exclude the Indian Guard in Indian Territory. At the state level were those units in Kansas. And there were 3 of these units that were going to be organized in Kansas. These black men, former slaves, most of them former slaves, were now going to use the rifle to fight for their own liberty. It did not take long, however, for these new black Kansans to recognize the relationship between soldiering and citizenship. In October of 1863, 23 delegates representing 7,000 black Kansans gathered at Leavenworth for the first meeting of the Kansas State Colored Convention. Now again, remember, these were folks who hadn't been in Kansas 3 years earlier. But by 1863, they are gathering together to talk about their future in their new state. They pledged to their new home their loyalty, their fidelity, but they also expressed, not surprisingly, a desire for full citizenship even when the Civil War was still raging. In other words, even when slavery itself had not been destroyed. The convention called for a number of things. I'll go through a couple. They called for universal male suffrage. Yes, male suffrage rather than universal suffrage. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the contradictions of Kansas, which is a radical state, yet its males who like to pride themselves on being radical voted against both black male suffrage or suffrage of males of color and female suffrage in 1867. So that's another issue that we'll hold. But the Kansas blacks understood their situation. They understood their own disabilities. They called for more self-help. They called for self-reliance. As they said in their statement, it does not follow that because so much is being done for us that we cannot do anything for ourselves. It does not follow that because so much is being done for us that we cannot do anything for ourselves. Finally, the convention issued a challenge to white Kansas, and this kind of challenge will be the first of many that would extend, how about up until the year 2000? And this challenge went something like this, and I'll just read part of it. Our misery is not necessary to your happiness. Your rights can never be secured while ours are denied. Your rights, they're speaking to white Kansans, your rights can never be secured while ours are denied. Black people were becoming free. They were becoming free in a variety of ways. They were becoming free not simply because of the actions of white men in Washington. They were becoming free not simply because of the action of white men in Kansas, people like John Brown, although I will argue that the actions of those men in Kansas and elsewhere were a major force in terms of creating the idea that the West, the post-Civil War West, was going to be a place for opportunity and liberty. But I would also suggest that black people were becoming free themselves essentially by their own actions, not simply by running away or walking away from slavery, but by using every single device at their disposal to challenge the institution. They were very much like the young Charles Mitchell. Charles Mitchell in 1860 challenged slavery by running away. And there were thousands of others who would do the same thing all over the West. And as a result of their actions, they made sure that slavery wouldn't sink very, very deep roots in the West. But I want to, even as we end with this, I want to caution you and I want to sort of look forward to this and look forward by expressing to you the words of at least two former black Texas slaves who had concerns about, but also believed in the promise of liberty once slavery was destroyed. These slaves were Felix Haywood, I've quoted him a lot tonight, and of course H.C. Smith. Let me read Haywood's quote. Haywood said in 1865, "We knowed freedom," these are his words, "we knowed freedom was on us, but we didn't know what to do with it. Freedom would make folks proud, but it didn't make them rich." Contrast this with the statement of H.C. Smith, another former Texas slave. "Freedom in poverty and in tribulations, even amidst the most cruel prejudice, is still sweeter than the best fed or the best clothed slavery in the world." As this next lecture will show, at least I hope it will show, slavery in the West was dead, but freedom would remain struggling to be born. Thank you very much. I want to go to the next slide. I want to leave this up, folks. As I said before, this is my dedication to Constance Thomas, a woman who helped me enormously in terms of pursuing my path, my chosen occupation of African American history in the West. We have a few minutes. I guess we have just a few minutes left for questions.
I had a question about citizenship in terms of when people were in the territories, because until I believe it's the 14th Amendment, no African Americans were not citizens of the United States. Were there any provisions in terms of those territories that African Americans actually were citizens within those territories?
Well, I don't think, well, let me put it like this. Citizenship is always contested. And certainly there were those who argued in different states or different places that African Americans weren't citizens, but there were others who argued differently. And the case was supposedly, the case of black citizenship was supposedly settled by Dred Scott. But as you all know, Dred Scott didn't settle anything. Dred Scott, helped to bring about the Civil War, and it's the Civil War that would settle the citizenship question. But that there were African Americans who moved to California at least, and who came from places where they had been citizens before, who believed that they were citizens in California, although they didn't vote. But they did protest to gain the right to vote, and eventually they would triumph. There were black folks, and most of the black folks who came to Texas were not citizens. Most of them who came were slaves. And they obviously did not contest for their citizenship. So the question of citizenship is to some extent determined by the source of the migration. But ultimately, and again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in terms of the lecture, ultimately black folks would gain citizenship and voting rights in some instances far more rapidly in the West than elsewhere. Voting rights would come for all African Americans in 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment. But there is the Territorial Suffrage Act, and I know I'm giving away the story now, but the Territorial Suffrage Act came in 1867, and that established voting rights for blacks in places like Colorado Territory and Wyoming Territory and even Washington Territory as early as 1867, although as you're going to see, black folks voted in Washington Territory even before 1867. So to say the least, this is complicated and complex. But certainly, as a general trend, voting rights are an indication of citizenship. Voting rights were going to be established earlier in the West, even than in the Reconstruction South. One more question.
You talked about the wealthy Indians who owned slaves. Mm-hmm. How many were there? How many wealthy Indians were there, and how did they get that way? And what happened to them?
Again, it's a very complicated story. I think there were, as in the general society, there were Indians who essentially adopted civilization or European civilization, and they became involved in sedentary agriculture, and if they were lucky, they acquired land. If there were Indian women who married wealthy and prominent traders, then all of their descendants became wealthy. And as I said, that's one of the reasons as to why these people began to inherit slaves. But in many instances, once slavery, and this is the unfortunate thing, once slavery was established and once some people gained control over other people's labor, then they were able to accumulate wealth at a faster rate than others who did not have slave labor. And as a result, these enormous class divisions began to emerge in Indian territory. So there are a variety of forces that were at work even before the Trail of Tears, that would sort of extend class barriers between and among Indians. Now let me be very clear on this. This doesn't hold for, if you will, nomadic peoples like the Apache. It doesn't hold for the Comanche. They had a slavery, but it wouldn't be the kind of slavery that would support sedentary agriculture or that would look like plantation agriculture. The 5 nations of the old Southeast, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminoles, those were the ones who were going to be most devoted to the institution of slavery, because those were the nations that most eagerly embraced Western civilization. And the tragic irony here is that embracing civilization for many of these folks meant embracing all that represented, including slavery. And once they did, and those who were successful, they would eventually acquire wealth disproportionately to the others. I mean, it's hard to imagine now in the days long before there was affirmative action that the Indians in the Indian territory, that the Creeks and the Choctaw sent their sons, not their daughters, their sons to Harvard and Yale. But obviously that's not the image that we have. That's not the image that we have of Indian people. And I think that's probably a good note in which we can stop, because as I said at the very beginning of this, the West, looking at the West and looking at the black experience in the West causes me, and I hope it's causing you, to challenge a lot of your conventional wisdom, a lot of what you call conventional wisdom about not only the West, but about the nature of race and the nature of American society. Okay, we'll stop at this point, and we'll see all of you 1 week from tonight. Thank you.